let me just say this has been one of the most exciting projects I have ever worked on. And really, really grateful that we have had the chance to do this together with Patrick Small from the City of Manassas, with Tom Flynn and Christina Nguyen from the Prince William County, with our leadership here at the university. Paula Sorrell is here in the room as well, and with all of you. And all of you, that's a really important component in this, right? Because as we're doing this, as we're thinking about this area, anchored by George Mason SciTech campus as being an innovation district, we've got to get it right together, and we've got to impact our local businesses that are within the district and around, as well as our residents. And as Governor Youngkin often says, we want to make sure that our residents flourish. And that's really front and center in what we are working to do here together. I want to thank our sponsors. So this all began thanks to a Go Virginia planning grant, which was also matched by local funding. So we have all of our sponsors here. So thank you, Prince William County, City of Manassas, Employment Enterprises, Prince William Chamber, Bob. You've been a fantastic partner, really throughout these working groups, really making sure again that we're connecting with our business community and providing something that is really desirable to transform this region. Micron, ATCC, MAG Enterprises, as well as George Mason University. So thank you all for your contribution to this planning study that we did in collaboration with Stiletto. If you haven't seen it, we have a concept plan. We want you to see it. We want your comments and your feedback. We are in the process of writing a Go Virginia implementation grant for submission in March, with hopeful launch of this innovation district in July. With that said, I'd be remiss if I didn't say thank you to Jackie Crick from ECU Communications as being our first founding sponsor and member of the Innovation District. So let's give her a round of applause. For every $1 of matching funds, we're able to unlock $2 from Go Virginia. And so I know several of you in the room are considering that contribution and are truly grateful for you, because again, this is a community endeavor. And without that, we can't make this work and make it work right. All right, so we have a couple of distinguished guests, actually a lot of distinguished guests that I want to recognize before we get into our program. We have Delegate Maldonado. Supervisor Angry. Supervisor Gordy. Supervisor King Bodie. And have I missed anybody? Okay, perfect. Madam Mayor did send her regrets. She was supposed to be able to come and unfortunately had other things come up at the last minute. But again, I just want to really mark this, that this is a collaboration between the City of Manassas, Prince William County, George Mason University, and our community. Doing it together is the only way we're going to do it and do it right. Well, we have another special guest to get us kicked off with some opening remarks. Brian Dermody, he's the Chief Strategy Officer for the Association of University Research Parks, and is the reason I'm able to know what an innovation district is and the impact that it makes in this community. So he has been an advisor to so many across this nation and really a champion within government to make sure that we're thinking about these communities of innovation and their impact. Brian.
Thanks, Amy. As you mentioned, my name is Brian Darby. I'm Chief Strategy Officer for the Association of University Research Parks. We are a global nonprofit membership organization. Our main office is at the University of Arizona Tech Park. And I have an office in the WeWork in the University of Maryland Discovery District in College Park, Maryland. So I just wanted to mention how I met Amy. So I was on the BioHealth Capital Region Forum, which is a nonprofit organization that's actually based in Rockville, but we try to bring together, in this case, bio folks from both Virginia, DC, and Maryland. And we had a conference every year. At the time, it was at the AstraZeneca campus, and we brought the then George Mason president to speak at what George Mason was doing in bio. He went on to Georgia Tech, where actually AURP had a member. But anyway, Amy's been a great colleague. She's on the AURP board, and I just wanted to acknowledge her great role in building life science communities of innovation, both here in Virginia, but across the country. So, history of research parks. You're going to hear from Colin, but just a little bit of history of how we got started. So, the world's first research park started at Stanford University. At the time, this was 1951, Stanford was not the international research university. It was more of it was a good research university, but it was in a very rural area. It was surrounded by almond orchards. And the dean of engineering, Francis Terman, he had a great idea. He said, industry needs to come to me or come to Stanford. So he entered a partnership, and it was with the city of Palo Alto. So it was not just the university, but the city of Palo Alto. There's some land adjacent to the campus. And they mowed down those almond orchards probably in 2 weeks. The developers here would probably like that because there was no environmental impact statement needed. There was no environmental restraints. They just mowed it down, and they started building that science park very quickly. And that science park, coincident with development of transistors, Bell Labs was in New Jersey. Some of the people there moved to the West Coast, and the whole electronics industry eventually grew up around Stanford. And because Stanford had a research park, companies could locate there, and university students could work at that park. So that was one of the first. Our colleagues down in North Carolina, they had a bunch of ag land, tobacco land, and they said, hey, we want one of those. So Research Triangle Park started there. So you had the development of research parks in urban, suburban, and rural settings across the country. A lot of them were in more rural areas because a lot of land-grant universities across the country, developed research parks. So that's, AURP now has members in 44 states. In the Commonwealth of Virginia, GMU, VCU, UVA, and Virginia Tech are all members of AURP. So we're a big tent. We like others to come in, and increasingly hospitals are even members. Like Children's National in Washington D.C. is a member. So people are rethinking about innovation districts, places where folks can go and grow. I was with Paula at the Autumn Conference, which was in Gaylord on the Potomac River, which is 2,000 people, tech commercialization folks from universities across the country. And we held a reception with the folks from the greater Washington region, trying to expose people to the fact that this region has lots and lots of assets on the federal side, on the academic side, and the institutional side. So what's the role of innovation districts and research parks? I like to say the biggest tech transfer event happens once a year, and it has nothing to do with patents. We call that event graduation. So when you have students graduating in tech fields like you have here with the emphasis at this campus, you need a place for them to connect with industry. You need a place for them to house themselves and grow families. And so that's one of the key reasons why innovation districts and research parks are really important for economic growth. I'm just going to briefly talk a little bit about bio because that's an emphasis here. So I read a lot of biographies, so it's amazing to read anyone who lived in the 18th or 19th century, how they will talk about, they maybe had 5 brothers and sisters, and only 2 survived to, past age 20. How many people died in infancy? It's amazing. And thanks to medical advances, we no longer have that kind of data point. But so medicine improved a lot, but in 1980, a couple things happened. The Bayh-Dole Act, which allowed universities to own the patents from federally sponsored research passed, and that's why we have the whole Autumn Tech Commercialization Group happen. That same year, the Cohen-Boyer patent for recombinant DNA was issued, and that same year, Genentech was founded, and it appeared on the front page of Time magazine at a time when people actually paid attention to what was on the front page of Time magazine. So that was kind of an important year, and over those years, the bio industry grew quite a bit, and I think you're seeing some of the fruits of that here, some fundamental research, and indeed more applied applications you're going to be seeing coming out of this innovation district and innovation districts like that across the country. So AURP, we have a BioHealth Caucus. We meet before Bio, which is a big industry meeting that takes place, and we talk about how do you build life science communities of innovation. It's expensive, as I'm sure our colleagues at George Mason are finding. It's expensive, it's difficult, but it has real-world applications for developing new therapies to sustain human health. So we, in Boston on June 15th or 16th, if you're going to Bio, please think about joining our BioHealth Caucus meeting. And then I mentioned the Capital Region Forum, which is a free event. It's now taking place at US Pharmacopoeia, which is in Rockville, Maryland. That's going to be on September 23rd to 25th. If you're not familiar with that, folks from DC, Maryland, Virginia, John Newby from Virginia Bio will be there. So put that on your calendar, and we hope to see you there. And I'm going to turn this back to Amy, and she's going to introduce our main speaker.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you for being a thought leader in this space and a really terrific mentor. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you Colin Clark. He is a director for economic growth at the George W. Bush Institute in Dallas, Texas, and has a background not only in the academic world, but also in the investment, and a really eclectic education as well from Harvard, Yale, Southern Methodist, and so really honored for him to be here. He has had nothing to do with our planning study, which I think is the beauty of that, right? How can we learn from others, looking from the outside in, making sure that we're not just touting our own, but really thinking about what are the impact of these innovation districts. He's done some tremendous studies on studying innovation districts across the United States, housing, and beyond. Colin, it is such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Let's see, are the slides set? Yeah. Good morning. I am so happy to be with you all and honored to be here in Prince William County. I was with a number of you all for dinner last night. It was a wonderful occasion. I have toured the Manassas battlefield site, I think 3 times in my life, but other than that, I have not been in your county, and what I saw in the course of touring around with Amy yesterday and with Tom Flynn was nothing short of astounding. So congratulations on all the great things that you all are doing here. So what I would like to talk about, as advertised, is innovation districts. What they are, why they're doing as well as they are, why are so many cities and towns adopting them. I'm just going to get a quick couple words about where I work, describe to some degree the idea of innovation districts, what are people trying to achieve and why, and present some data on that we've researched on how we're doing. Very quickly, I work at the George W. Bush Institute. We are the think tank, and as President Bush likes to say, do tank arm of the George W. Bush Presidential Center. We have a great museum. Come to Dallas. I would love to tour you around it. I think quite a few of you all have Texas connections, which I was really delighted to hear about over the last 24 hours. About the George W. Bush Institute. We are in the business of applying certain timeless American values that have figured prominently in President Bush's public service, among them freedom, opportunity, accountability, and compassion to pressing issues of our own time. And in my own economic work, that I lead the economic work of the place, we are very focused on how to expand opportunity for all Americans. And we look at this question in particular through the lens of place. How can we create more prosperous, high opportunity places And that could mean states, regions, cities, towns, neighborhoods, or indeed innovation districts. How can we create more such places that will be inclusive and will create as much opportunity as possible for Americans everywhere? I've had the chance to write about this a fair bit among other things, in the context of my own state. I co-authored a book called The Texas Triangle. It is about the rise of the mega region, as we call it, formed by the 4 big metropolitan areas of our state: Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Austin, and San Antonio. I can only say this outside of Texas, but only in Texas would we connect 4 points on the map by a triangle. But I assure you, if you look at the interstate highways, it more or less works. But I've also had a chance to write about innovation districts in the larger context of EDS and MEDS institutions. So about a year ago, we came out with this report that we call Engines of Opportunity: How EDS and MEDS can play a more powerful role in our cities, towns, and regions. So EDS and MEDS meaning research universities and academic medical centers. Our answer, very simply, we borrowed this rubric from a couple other organizations that came up with it, but because it's kind of widely accepted, I thought we can roll with this. The answers very simply fall into these 3 buckets of broadening, increasing talent development networks, accelerating innovation, and creating great places. And I think the 3rd bucket is oftentimes the least commented upon. Sometimes universities, I think, understand it the least because they oftentimes don't fully think through what a powerful footprint they have in their communities and how much difference they can make through how they manage that footprint. So, innovation districts. So, with respect to my good friend Brian, Association of University Research Parks, we make no distinction between these terms. I got an email from one guy who complained about my innovation district thing, saying it's 2 radically different ideas. So if that's so, Brian can clarify that to me. But I'll say a little bit about how the ideas evolved. But very basically, we are talking about relatively dense, physically compact places, urban or potentially, definitely suburban, but still, generally speaking, an environment that is where there's a reasonable density of people, where knowledge-generating institutions and leading-edge companies, typically of various sizes and typically of multiple industries, cluster together to stimulate creativity, collaboration, innovation, and entrepreneurship. So leading examples include probably the 3 most prominent ones in America: Stanford Research Park, as Brian talked about, also Kendall Square in Cambridge, Massachusetts, across the street from the front door of MIT, and the Research Triangle Park in the Raleigh-Durham area, North Carolina. Other prominent ones that have been around for a while, in West Philadelphia near the University of Pennsylvania. I could add lots of others, but we have a couple that have kind of grown up recently in my state as well. Typically, what's really kind of, I think, very interesting and challenging, but also stimulating about this whole area, is we're typically talking about a wide variety of players coming together to make these places happen that don't always necessarily have loads of experience working together. So almost inevitably, there are EDS and MEDS institutions that at the very least are the kind of the anchor tenant and a major reason why the Innovation District, or the reason why the Innovation District is where it is. But oftentimes they're really kind of playing the quarterback role as well. But meanwhile, you have, as I note here, real estate developers inevitably play a role. This is partly a real estate undertaking. Entrepreneurs and investors who will kind of populate the place. Large firms, ideally. That certainly adds something, of course. Philanthropists and community nonprofits. Local government almost invariably plays a role, sometimes state, and very often, or sometimes, a separate management entity that is overseeing the place, marketing it, and programming it. And the phenomenon is growing very, very fast. By my count, there are certainly more than 150 in the world, compared to probably less than 20 in the year 2000. I generated a new count looking at Brian's Association of University Research Parks, list of members, map, and a couple other lists out there. In the United States, there are a little over 80 by, I think, a strict definition, and you could easily get to significantly larger numbers if you'd like. I'm going to present here in a moment some data from a fresh data set that we put together that looks at 36 districts here in the United States. Some of them would call themselves research parks. But of these 36, 21 were launched just since the year 2000, and 10 of them since the year 2013. In my own area of the Dallas-Fort Worth area, we had 0 that would ever use the term as of 2018. Now we have, depending on how you count it, 6 or 7 aspiring entrants into this space. And dozens of universities are planning new ones. Here's very simply where the innovation districts and research parks in our data set are. So why do people do this? Well, very simply, we have in the field of urban economics the idea of what we call agglomeration economies. That means the benefits in terms of innovation and productivity that come from having a lot of smart people in different kinds of firms operating in close proximity together. And it's all based on the idea of collisions, serendipitous as well as planned. Two ideas, two smart people come together, give birth to a third idea. And that very simply is why people do this, because there's lots of evidence that this in fact occurs. The Stanford economist Nicholas Bloom and colleagues have tried to look at this phenomenon very, very closely and have concluded that the benefits of proximity operate most powerfully if two different people who might operate, work in different, maybe one in the university, one in the business world, primarily spend their working time less than a quarter mile away from each other. As you go beyond a quarter mile, the effects attenuate. So proximity turns out to be pretty important. And there's a quote here, I think, from an executive from a biotech firm in Kendall Square that I think captures very nicely. This is from a really good book called, let's see, well, at any rate, it's a book by the journalist Robert Buderi, Where Futures Converge, about Kendall Square in Cambridge. And she says, to benefit from Kendall Square, you have to leave your office and get out into the square. It wasn't until I joined a small biotech where collaboration outside the company was essential that I realized the power of Kendall Square. It's all there, so many points of intersection. That's what we're all trying to create with these efforts. So from the point of view of a university or a mayor, let's say, a leader of a county, what in specific terms are people trying to achieve? What are their motivations? Three very simple ones. Number one, promote local economic development, very simply. And this reflects what I would call the new geography of prosperity and jobs, something of a shift from what we've seen maybe in the second half of the 20th century. And a very simple proposition I will put to you, and that is that talented people choose where they want to live based on they think it's a good place to live, and businesses follow. It's very much the reverse of maybe a historic pattern where businesses decide where maybe the land and the operating costs are cheap and the workers follow. And what do people want? Well, it seems that the main thing they want is a high amenity, high quality of life place at a reasonable, a somewhat manageable price point. Ultra cheap, generally speaking, doesn't actually bring very good quality of life, so that's not most of what people are looking for. And businesses want great talent. Another thing businesses want to be is close to where the ideas originate. And where do they originate? Typically, either in eds and meds institutions or in other innovative businesses. And that's what people are trying to get close to. And here's a contrarian observation. I say it's contrarian because there's a lot of narrative out there that the whole innovation economy has been growing more concentrated in places like the Bay Area, Boston, New York. Some would say the DC metro. I think I can present lots of evidence, qualitative, quantitative, otherwise, to show that this is exactly wrong. The geography of innovation is spreading out. Among other things, it's spreading out into whole new parts of the country. Among other things, a rise of a number of Sun Belt places that have been doing very, very well. My understanding is the Richmond area is doing very, very well. I don't know if that's sunny or not. Yesterday doesn't go to count as Sun Belt. Maybe today. Also, it's spreading out into what are essentially very fast-growing suburban, exurban type areas, among others, like where we are. Second motivation, you could say it's part of the first, but I'll make a separate second slide out of it, is a second motivation is to strengthen education institutions themselves and workforce development systems. So universities engage in this because it is in their own self-interest to do so. Why is that so? Partly because university leaders are finding that to attract and retain talent, it is good news to have an adjacent innovation district that the place is involved in. And also because, and this is something we show in our report, I think in considerable detail, that the whole idea of the success of universities in commercializing their inventions, creating new products that change the world, is positively correlated with a lot of other aspects of the university mission. There is a traditional idea that oftentimes academics have that if we go too far down the commercialization road, it will detract from the kind of pristine, pure science and the teaching mission. That just isn't true. There's loads of evidence in other reports, and in our report we present some new statistical evidence to that effect as well. And as for workforce development, what I would say very simply is if you create a successful innovation district, you create lots of job opportunities, lots of internship opportunities, And I think you create what people would perhaps call a flywheel effect. Success breeds more success. Young people, like in the picture there, work someplace in, for example, Research Triangle Park, and they're that maybe as an intern, and they're that much more motivated to take more classes at Wake Tech, which has done a great job in the Raleigh area of creating programs that are well designed to actually create people who know how to work in all the various Research Triangle Park areas. So nice effects there. Third motivation is to accelerate innovation itself. Can that possibly be done? I want to argue that it can. That innovation is not just something that happens out there, it's something that we try to facilitate, we try to encourage it, and we can actually speed it up to some degree. So what I want to suggest is that we have maybe gross oversimplification. 3 models of how to do innovation in America. A 19th century model. Maybe this was always a little bit of an exaggeration, but the lone tinkerer like Thomas Edison in his lab, he wasn't really totally alone, he had a lot of assistants, but more or less. In the 20th century, I would argue that we moved towards the idea of increasingly large, hierarchical, command and control kind of organizations, not unlike IBM, show IBM campus there, maybe not unlike in some respects the military. And we created universities to some degree, and with our own quirks, but to some degree in that image. So here's MIT, which was built very much with a corporate model in mind in the early 20th century, and then built up further in the aftermath of World War II. I would argue that in the 21st century, we're moving towards a new model that hasn't totally scrapped the large command and control organizations, but puts much greater emphasis on networked, lots of different kinds of organizations with different forms of expertise coming together, and out of this, that it can't be centrally managed, out of it emerges a sense of order, out of it emerges something that works, because successful networks do that. Why might that be so? I would argue very simply, I think there are studies that show that the number of people that it takes to achieve a certain increment of innovation, so kind of you have to define that for purposes of the study, has been going up pretty fast. And so it could be that if you were going to try to centralize all of some kind of chain of innovation within a single corporation, today you have to have a really, really, really large R&D department. And it appears that maybe there are diseconomies of scale. At some point, it becomes cumbersome to have too large a corporate R&D department. It just becomes better to have different organizations working with each other across company lines and across the university business divide. So it just seems that's the way the world is going. Can't say for sure why it's so, but it seems to be so. Let me say a little bit about innovation in America. I promised Brian some slides that maybe I can't remember if I've seen them before. I want to suggest, the line, Houston, we have a problem. America, we have a problem. So if we think of our national innovation ecosystem, here, let me boil it down real simple formula, what we call a production function in economics. The production now, not of products, but of ideas. Well, you have inputs of a certain number of things. You have a process that turns the input into outputs, where the output is an idea, okay? What of the inputs? What I show on the left side here is the total federal investment into R&D as a percentage of the economy over the long haul. This has been, I would argue, the single most important input alongside talented people, but the talented people won't do the work unless you have a budget to, pay them, buy equipment and so forth. And it's been on a long-term downtrend, and it took a sharp turn still further downwards after the financial crisis of 2008 and never bounced back. It sort of threatened to bounce back a little with the CHIPS and Science Act, but actually Congress never appropriated the funds that it had promised for most of that increase in research that they had in mind. And now we have something entirely new that I'll comment on in a moment. On the right, how do we compare to other countries? Very simply, the red line, United States, as a share of the economy. You could argue maybe you can find an upward trend in that. I don't really find much. A number of other countries spend a lot larger percentage of their economy than we do. How about turning inputs into useful ideas? These charts are from a study that was printed in Nature. I think it was a very consequential study, and what these people did is they looked at 25 million academic papers that have been published and 5 million patents. They had AI-based tools evaluating all these papers to evaluate high score if they were transformational, new breakthrough science, low score if they were very incremental, in a sense, confirming what we already know. The average score across all of those papers has been in a continuous downtrend over several decades. We're producing more papers than ever before, but the amount of breakthrough per paper, or per research project, if you will, is going down. And here, if you want to look at how we're doing in market share terms, if you want to think of it in How about America versus other countries? The dotted line on top. These are market shares in shares of where the scientists are based who publish papers in the very top scientific journals. Okay. The dotted line going down is the United States, passing Europe on the way down, and the rising line is China. So I'll just say a little before I talk about innovation districts, a little something, and hopefully we have a little time for Q&A, and ask away if you want to talk about what we're seeing. Everyone's obviously followed the troubling news about what the administration has been doing with NIH grants in particular. I just had the chance, I led a group of students from SMU in a class I'm teaching around DC. We met with a bunch of people, and what I'll simply say, I don't know anything that you all don't know, but what I will simply say is, wherever we talk with anyone, the mood was pretty negative about the outlook, where the dust will settle, where things will land. And the staffers that we talked to on Capitol Hill said they've never seen such low levels of support, including both sides of the aisle to a certain degree, for the basic idea of sustaining federal investment in university research. So Brian and I were just talking about it. The dust will settle. There'll be some outcome of all this. It just seems real likely that the outcome will be that these lines I was showing about share of the economy will keep going down. And that's not good news for America. But innovation districts can't in themselves necessarily bring a whole lot more dollars into the innovation system in our country, but they can create more output per dollar, and that is what we're trying to do here. So what this somewhat busy chart does is I try to describe over time how the idea of the research park or innovation district has been evolving, which is to say when people set out to build a new one, like you're doing here in Prince William County, what are people generally trying to achieve? And that has been changing. So we have on the left side, we have a model that goes back to the 19th century of industrial districts where businesses tended to congregate close together. If you were, if you were the 11th company that was going to set up a textile factory of some sort in New York City, and the other 10 were all in the garment district, rather than go way across town, you'd probably go to the garment district too, because that's where the talented labor would be, that's where the intermediate goods and raw material suppliers are all set up. That was a logical thing to do. So agglomeration economies existed even then. We had in the years after World War II the rise of the research park or science park, typically in suburban areas. I would argue that was primarily driven by essentially creating lower costs, better quality of life for the workers relative to then conditions in some core cities. We then in the 00s saw something of a return to the city or the creation of, if you will, kind of new alternative cities, new alternative downtowns in suburban areas. I think this was driven basically, as I note here, by people really kind of glomming onto this idea of the benefits of proximity, basically saying that maybe on Route 128 in Massachusetts, we created some great farms, but they were just a little too far apart from each other, surrounded by giant surface parking lots and big highways. And if you wanted those benefits, you needed to get people a little bit closer together. In the 2010s, I want to suggest we really saw a much greater focus on live, work, play, all in close proximity, creating great urban places, including creating new urban places in areas that were rural or exurban, if you will. And then in the 2020s, I think the whole thing got still more complicated because we started to think really in new ways about, well, what are the effects that radiate outwards from a successful innovation district? Ultimately, is this undertaking actually inclusive? Is it creating opportunities for all kinds of people who are living relatively close by, or is it perhaps just raising real estate prices and displacing people who might have lived nearby for a long period of time? And so a much greater emphasis on how to be inclusive and how to create not just a district itself that is successful, but outward neighborhood effects that in general the community will be supportive of. So the state of the art today, very simply, I'll just keep this, I think it's all basically there. I think what today people are trying to achieve, they want, of course, strong basic science, a critical mass of talent in one place, a big compact mixed-use environment with live and play alongside the work, a diversity of firms and industries, not one. Monoculture seems to be bad these days. I think economists support that. Clearly one or more major research centers, and not just ones that are very good at doing research, but have an entrepreneurial culture with a well-oiled tech transfer and commercialization arm. Creating all of that is hard for universities, so but being good at it seems to make a big difference. Intentional design that promotes these serendipitous collisions of people and ideas in the context of a high-quality, authentic sense of place. We might be creating a place where there really wasn't one before, but do it well and make it inclusive and accessible. And it takes time. The whole Kendall Square story in the book that I noted, what has been called the most innovative square mile on planet Earth. There was a ribbon cutting with the mayor there in 1960. For about 40 years after that, on the whole, I think people there would have said, at best, this has been marginally successful. Only by about the year 2000 would people have definitively said, yes, we have in fact created the biotech capital of the planet. Some other elements, you got to get the physical assets in place, obviously. We're talking about a little bit of a complex undertaking, because generally we're talking about really nice Class A office and lab space, oftentimes with wet lab, sometimes clean rooms. It's really expensive to do. And if the demand is there, you got to keep going and build more of it. Also, you have this basic problem that ideally you want to be in a hospitable place for startups, but a notable thing about startups, most of the time, unless they're AI firms in Silicon Valley, is they don't have lots of money and can't afford the most expensive rents. So making this somehow work is tricky. But startups really are vital. Here's another quote from a Kendall Square entrepreneur about how startups are rejuvenating because they're always attracting and developing new talent. I think innovation districts are also trying to be very thoughtful about how they curate their tenant base, and lots of aggressive programming about accelerator programs, networking opportunities, value-added services of various kinds. And of course, having live and play alongside the work. Creating actual housing nearby was not a priority until pretty recently, and now most definitely it is. We're generally talking about pretty good-looking, kind of contemporary places that really generally kind of all look like that. And creating great outdoor gathering spaces. Just seeing that in place after place. So how are America's innovation districts actually doing in kind of accomplishing these things? And Brian might debate me on some of these things. I tried to make just in preparing for this talk a loose sense of what were like the 25 top innovation districts or research parks in America. I put what are probably the 3 most prestigious ones, and then looking at the next 22 behind that. And if we look at, creating high quality of life, like the live and play aspect, actual housing in or very close to the district or park, and to what degree have they sort of created governance structures that are bringing together all these different parties in a way that works effectively in a kind of sustainable way, even when individual leaders who've done a great job maybe leave, and you kind of want continuity in the place. And the message that I want to convey in this slide is, it's a work in progress. I'm sure people can differ. In Kendall Square, they might say, you're crazy. Of course, we've actually built some housing. Well, the truth is they actually built no housing whatsoever for like more than 40 years. Until very recently in the immediate vicinity there, very, very expensive real estate. Just recently there have been some that have started to go up, but I think they would still say, we got a giant problem there. Stanford Research Park, of course, has wonderful quality of life amenities, trails for biking and so forth, not so much the other stuff. Research Triangle Park, I definitely commend to you all as a place under Scott Levitan, the leader there, has been extremely innovative at turning what was a very, very deconcentrated suburban research park into, particularly in the heart of it, the RTP hub, into essentially a new alternative downtown for the Raleigh-Durham area at scale, kind of all in one fell swoop. And then as for the next 22, in my very loose ranking that I'm not going to publish the ranking anyplace, but I would say on each of these metrics, we're typically talking about 4, 5, 6 that have really made significant headway on these various issues, but everybody's trying on all of them. Okay. Some interesting recent launches, and this is kind of not fair because there have been, I'm sure, loads of others that I don't have in the slide. This happened to be ones I pay close attention to. It's interesting to see in big, booming cities, kind of an outbreak in places like Charlotte, San Antonio, Tampa, that weren't in any case seen as like major hubs of research and innovation, until maybe very recently they're trying to become so. Around leading medical centers getting in on the act, Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. It's also to see in innovative smaller cities a real determination to not be left out. Some of us were at a URP event in Northwest Arkansas, where clearly there's an enormous effort backed by vast Walton family money. And also, I think an interesting model is Rowan outside of Atlanta, which is a kind of rural or exurban location, but tied into to related activities in Atlanta, in three different innovation districts that are within the city of Atlanta. So some ideas there. To my data, very briefly. So we collected data on 36 districts, and what we wanted to, and couldn't possibly be comprehensive, not possible, there are too many, and there'd be definitional questions, but all of these 36 are unequivocally places that call themselves an innovation district or a research park, have some kind of well-organized marketing message, and have reached some degree of scale. And our basic method is to collect data on the immediate area based on census tracts, the data that is hyperlocal, and look at how those places are performing on a lot of measures that most people would consider to be indicative of success in economic development. So here's kind of our main data. How are they doing? By the way, all of our data is up on our website. You can link to it through our report and find data at the level of each of the 36 individual districts and parks. But this is just the unweighted average of the 36 on all of these numbers, just for overview purposes. And here's the answer. Here I've compared them to metropolitan America as a whole, so 85% of the population, but we also, in the report, in the data set, compare them to their own metropolitan area and their own county, okay? And no matter how you look at it, they have outperformed to some degree in actually creating population growth, just people living in these surrounding areas, for creating a concentration of people who have relatively high educational attainment, people who work in what the urbanist Richard Florida calls creative professions. That includes kind of all manner of innovative professions. Pretty dramatic outperformance. And commuting times are something we economists look at a lot because that really measures the extent to what extent are you creating jobs close to where people live. And the answer is that these places are pretty dramatically outperforming for holding commuting times down, and while the commuting times did increase a little since 2010 by significantly less than metropolitan America as a whole. That tells us we're creating both jobs and population here. We also can look within the data and say among these 36, what factors explain why some do better on the metrics I've just noted than others? And here are some simple findings. Well, this is one that kind of made me happy as an enthusiast for innovation districts. And that is just the age of the district, how long has it been going? Keep going long enough and the effects accumulate. And how big, by lots of different measures of bigness. Physical size, probably not the most relevant thing because it can be very concentrated or very dispersed, but number of firms, number of people working there, number of dollars going in, and so forth. Those are predictive of bigger effects, economic development effects. How strong are the anchor eds and meds institutions as research powers? Metro area housing policies. If the housing policies are extremely adverse to building new housing, and quick aside, I have another report coming out very, very soon that is all about housing in America, and it will generally say every place is too restrictive on housing, okay? But some are more restrictive than others, and the really restricted ones, they might be doing great research and innovation, which should be creating a lot of jobs, but very few can afford to live there, and the net result is kind of not everything that they had hoped for. The location in the metropolitan area matters a lot. I will say kind of downtown or downtown adjacent type districts are generally doing pretty well. And actually one factor that doesn't predict success, perhaps surprisingly, is how big is the surrounding community. College town type of areas are actually doing very, very well. I also have, we looked in detail at housing and issues that I would call around neighborhood stability. And here the outperformance is pretty dramatic. So we've got just by numerous measures, is housing getting built? And the answer is to a far greater degree than in other comparable places, which I would argue is partly an indicator of whether the locality is allowing the housing to be built, but it's also an indicator of economic development, like people living in, wanting to be there. And also what's happening with price and rent. Not surprisingly, prices and rents are moving up faster than other places, but still what we find is it's not gone crazy in most places. It has gone crazy in, say, Cambridge, Massachusetts. Issues around displacing populations that were already there. One frustrating thing for urban economists is we don't have very good data, we don't have any really good ways of measuring the extent to which people are being displaced. Very hot issue, important issue, really hard to measure, okay? However, it is a tragic historic reality of our country that displacement oftentimes has a significant racial overlay. And so one thing that we do as a very crude and imperfect proxy is to measure the combined Black and Hispanic population, and the data set has each group separately in the surrounding area. What do we find? The combined Black and Hispanic population share in these areas actually is a little bit higher than in metropolitan America as a whole. And it's actually gone up some. In fact, it's gone up more than in metropolitan America as a whole. There are some districts where there's very significant evidence for displacement, and these numbers have gone down to a pretty remarkable degree. What do I attribute this to? I attribute this to the following. If you want to contain displacement, there are lots of measures you might do in your toolkit, but the single most important one is build new housing. Because if you're creating a place that has a lot of demand for housing, create the corresponding supply. If you do not, there will be ferocious competition for scarce real estate, and the people with the deepest pockets will win. And so very simply, these places are in fact adding a lot of new housing compared to other places, and in that sense, relatively speaking, in a world that isn't producing enough housing, they're outperforming. How about the actual office and lab real estate? We can assess how they're actually doing as real estate. And here's I think what we find. That the demand on the whole has been strong throughout this whole last several years. There has been, particularly in the biotech, biomedical side, something of a soft spot the last couple of years because interest rates going up has meant a big slowdown in the flow of venture capital money. So that sector has been, the demand has been a little bit weaker. CBRE and others have studied this and believe very, very strongly that there's pent-up demand. That there is ample demand finally to fill up some of the space that has opened up, including in biotech, but we might need to see a reopening of the venture capital spigot a little bit, but huge differences across metropolitan areas. So where we see actually low vacancy and really strong demand are some of the fast-growing places, some of the Sun Belt places like Raleigh-Durham, Atlanta, Nashville, Dallas, also Philadelphia, and in the Northeast and West Coast, we actually see higher vacancy and weaker demand. So what you are doing here is so exciting. It's so fun to see it. Some very, very initial thoughts. I guess I would say this because I'm delighted to be Amy's guest and to be with you all. But really, observing this over the last 24 hours really does reconfirm. It's hard not to be bullish. Here you all are in a premier metro area, and one that I would suggest is by no means fully saturated with innovation districts and research parks, plenty of room to grow. I would argue that notwithstanding everything coming out of the White House most recently, I've told you to some of you all this last night. I'm personally going to bet we're clearly going to see some shrinkage in the federal workforce, but I think a truly significant reversal in the long-term trend of the federal establishment growing as a share of the economy, I think is most unlikely. But maybe I'll be wrong. Very strong research university, clearly a strong collaboration from the get-go, from the start of this effort with county and local government, plus a really great location, with the only challenge being the fact that everywhere you turn is another data center, which has probably been great from a tax-based point of view, but maybe presents a few location challenges. A focus on a governance structure from the beginning, which oftentimes has not been present, and sometimes later comes back to bite parks and districts. What appears to be, in the concept document that Amy shared with me, a really well-developed plan for curating the tenant base, attracting the right kinds of tenants that will make the place work, and programming it aggressively and well. An emphasis also from the get-go on workforce development, which I think will serve you well. And what I hope will be, at least there's a sound funding plan. I've got to turn into real money, but it appears there's good efforts underway on that front. So my simple explanation, innovation districts are part of the answer to the problems that we face in America. They are part of the answer, not the whole answer, to expanding our talent development pipelines, creating opportunity, promoting innovation, building great urban places, and creating a brighter future in our country. I would be delighted to answer your questions. Thank you. Hello.
Hi, thanks so much. That was great. Question regarding the real estate lab space slide. Do you by chance know where the DMV falls within the demand and supply?
It hasn't been among the strongest, but it's been better than the middle of the pack. The weakest have been, New York, Boston, and West Coast. But every place is hurting a little bit. A lot of life science real estate has been built, hasn't quite built because of what's going on in Bedford. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Paula Sorrell from George Mason. So here we call it heads, meds, and feds.
That's good. I'll remember that.
For the trifecta. Can you talk about, most of what the entire university across all the campuses commercializes actually in the medical space. And off of this campus in particular, and it's because a large portion of our research portfolio is applied versus basic research. So a lot of it gets moved off to corporations, and then we have, most of our spin-outs are in that space as well. Can you talk about the connection? I'm sorry if you addressed this and I missed it, but the importance of the connection to a hospital system and the practitioners as part of that innovation driver?
Yeah, sure. It's an extremely complex question. Everyone heard it okay? Try to say a couple things kind of fast, and we can talk more afterwards if you'd like. First thing to say about medical is medical and life science research has been the dominant factor in university research for kind of a long time, and it also, perhaps, some of us talked about this last night at dinner, perhaps for cultural reasons as much as anything else. I think the biotech and life science world has been kind of the dominant or the biggest player on average in research parks and innovation districts. It is kind of notable how there are a number of areas of great innovation and great potential in our economy that have figured less prominently in university research and almost not at all in most innovation districts. And like I started with apologies to those who heard me say the same thing last night. In my own area of North Texas, for example, there is gigantic work going on innovating around the movement of goods, both through the air, in the form of drones, and along the ground, in the form of driverless vehicles. And that, I'm sure, does figure in some research programs here and there at universities, but we're just not seeing a lot of that in most innovation districts. Correct me if I'm wrong, maybe you can see them. Hospitals. The hospital dynamic is extremely complex. So you have first of all, you have the giant variation in how hospitals are doing, right? You have all the rural ones, smaller hospitals, which have been big market share losers over recent decades, and generally speaking, have a lot of financial distress. And then you have the highly consolidating, very big systems, oftentimes with an academic medical center, medical school attached, sometimes not, that have consolidated, have a negotiating power with payers and so forth, and generally speaking, in my experience, make bigger profit margins than they fess up to because they hide their profits in various places. They're enormously profitable in some cases. And so I think we are certainly seeing that in the innovation district space, the really profitable big ones want in on the act. You sometimes get curious cultural dynamics. So in my state of Texas, in Houston, we have something called the Texas Medical Center, the biggest conglomeration of hospitals in the world, in a highly condensed, walkable area. And then you have Rice University, actually quite nearby. Rice University set out to build an innovation district and said, hey, Texas Medical Center and all the dozens of constituent organizations within it, how about we do all this together? Texas Medical Center said, no, thank you. We want to do one that's just medical. So now you have two different efforts. The one that is actually relatively light on biomedical, and the other one that's 100% biomedical. The first one's come along farther than the latter, but we'll see. Another big factor that's part of the whole hospital equation is, you could say, well, how do we fund the basic research establishment of America? How do we finally pay for this whole thing, right? A lot of attention lately on federal R&D dollars, with good reason. Federal R&D dollars have been declining over quite a few years as a percentage of paying for the total research establishment of our country. Industry funding things within universities and so forth, has been on the upswing, but it's also a rather small percentage. Single biggest increase, we fund it through patient care. Single biggest increase is, it used to be if you were a medical school with hospital, right, and maybe part of a larger university, the medical school as such made a profit and sent money over to like a dividend, if you will, over to the head office of the university. In general, that's turned into a loss. And the question then is, how do we pay for that loss? One method would be to cut the expenses a lot until you're not losing money anymore. But another method turns out to be to roll up a great big patient care complex and run it profitably. And that has turned out to be the fastest growing method. So that, of course, those costs get passed on. And so here, it's a little bit of, I answered the question in a lot of ways, and I'm not sure any of them are exactly, but we have to somehow think about all these things. Like patient care paying for our research establishment is only, it's only sustainable if how we pay for healthcare services is sustainable. If you think it's not, you know, if we cut Medicaid spending a lot, for example, then we undermine another pillar of our research establishment. What else? Anybody? Yes, sir.
Thank you so much. I'm Suleiman coming up from TechBridge Management Solutions. So we are supporting non-profits. My question is especially about non-profits.
Nonprofit.
What's the role of non-profits in these innovation centers? And based on the statistics that you have, like, do you have any specific statistic about their collaboration? Because they have like a good role on our community development.
Sure. I personally, I'm a big supporter of the nonprofit world, involved in some myself in Dallas. I think the role is really important in innovation districts, increasingly so. If you look at some of the things that innovation districts are trying to accomplish, a couple of them are probably best accomplished by nonprofits. So, for example, if you are building an innovation district and you want to think about how to make it inclusive, how to create opportunity for a wide variety of people, well, you might, for example, want to create a number of internship or apprenticeship or even like exposure to science programs for high school or middle school kids. There's a number of things you might want to create when you have that concentration of talents in one place. How will you do that? Who will fund it? Who will operate it? At the very least, nonprofit like donors might well fund that specific thing because that's probably not going to be funded by, say, the federal government. And on top of that, they might operate it. So maybe in close partnership with the university, but maybe a nonprofit actually helps run the program of bringing a bunch of high schoolers, say, into the place. Funding apprenticeship and, or I should say, maybe job training opportunities for people who live nearby and are reskilling, if you will. I think there's an important role there. So I think, we're certainly, and I think also there's some things that government probably won't ever fund. So there are niche parts of the operation that you kind of want to step in and be an innovator funder that does that particular program where there isn't any other obvious source. Were there others back here?
1 second, sorry.
Okay, I'll come to you next, ma'am. We're first this man in your section, okay? Yes, sir.
Just one question when one talks about innovation institutes. Where does Silicon Valley, for instance, fit into your statistics? You look at the global or the Google Innovation Campus. What the corporate world is doing in innovation, how does that factor and figure into your statistics as well?
Since you're asking specifically about statistics, I will say that Silicon Valley is a special case. We made a decision not to have Stanford Research Park, the original research park, in our data set. Why is that? Because we wanted to be able to make explicit statements about what's happening close to the research park or close to the innovation district. If the whole innovation economy spreads way beyond nearby to, in effect, fill all of Santa Clara Valley, Santa Clara County, for example, then the comparison of inside Stanford Research Park versus all the other places where tech companies and biotech companies might be located is not a good comparison. So we recognize the historical significance of Stanford Research Park, but it's one of many good locations, or expensive locations, to operate if you're in Silicon Valley. So that's a special case. Other than that, corporate research campuses and so on, corporations might be running R&D facilities inside an innovation district as we've defined it, or they might be running it in a totally different location. If it's a totally different location, we're not studying that. That's an important thing in America for sure, but we haven't been studying it. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Sharon Gibson, and I'm with DHCD Go Virginia. Thank you so much for your presentation today. My ears really perked up when you started talking about how housing affects these innovation districts. We're in an area where the cost of living is particularly high, as you may know. I would love to know, based on your experience, has there been instances where housing truly was, what's the word? when housing really kind of paused the growth of an innovation district, and how soon should those housing stakeholders come to the table when we're thinking about growing innovation districts in Virginia?
That's a great question, one that's close to my heart. Housing growth causing the growth of an innovation district. I think the conventional answer would be that can't be, because no matter how much housing you build, finally the thing that causes the innovation district to come into being and succeed is because a few leaders really want it to, and they define it, and they go out and recruit, market the thing to businesses and so on. Maybe because university presidents and other top leaders embrace the initiative. But I'll say something a little bit unconventional here, and I think that places that have been successful in creating housing growth, they certainly couldn't bring about the growth of an innovation district by themselves, but I think that has played a role in the rise. I talked about the expanding geography of innovation. I think the fact that we've seen the success of so many innovation district and research park type efforts around these somewhat more affordable, still crazy prices, metropolitan areas of the Sun Belt, places from Arizona, Texas, the Carolinas, and into your state. I think in part that is caused by the fact that they managed to keep themselves more affordable, and the way they did that is for sure through better housing and land use policies. We got plenty of problems in all of our, from Virginia to Texas and over to Arizona in housing, but our problems are not as severe as the coast. Now, I do think that maybe the main message we want to convey around housing is, of course, yes, be a place where it generally make it possible to build enough housing for the people who live there and the people who might wish to live there. Of course, separate from innovation districts. And I've got a whole new report that will make that case. But in particular, as regards the innovation district, I think that it's incumbent on the people running the innovation district effort to have housing in mind, because, among other things, if every place around is deeply unaffordable, it's going to stunt the growth of the place for sure. And on top of that, housing that is very close by, like walkable, bikeable from where people are going to work to the lab or whatever, turns out to be important to a lot of people. Those people might skew young, but you're trying to attract young people. And it isn't necessarily only the youngest people who value walkability. Some others are going to as well, and so I think people running innovation districts almost universally understand that they have to get the housing piece has to be part of their puzzle. Some are succeeding better than others at implementing it.
Good morning, Tom Blazer. Thanks for making the trip. You're a smart guy, and I appreciate your insights. Two questions. First, what is the one thing that we can do locally to improve our district? And then secondly, what the heck is SMU doing in the Atlantic Coast Conference?
I'm not an expert on the latter. We have a fellow SMU alum here. I'm an SMU PhD alum. The only thing I would say about the latter is apparently SMU made it very worth the while, dollars-wise, to the pre-existing members of the ACC. So whether it will ever pay off for SMU is something that is maybe beyond the realm of economists to understand. So I have nothing more to say about that. But I know the folks in Dallas who led that effort are extremely excited about it. As for, let's see, remind me your first question. I got so tired.
One thing we can do.
One thing, of course, one thing. Again, apologies to people I talked about. We talked about this last night with. If I would say one thing, it's plan for, allow for, and indeed create a somewhat denser live, work, play environment in the heart of your district than anybody imagines makes sense. Allow it to happen. Plan for it. The housing piece. Allow for the fun, quality of life aspects, the trails, the little parks. Do it all in a way that almost seems absurd given the current density level of the area, because it will excite people and they will come, and before long, sometime, if perhaps in the lifetime of those of us who are in the room, and certainly in the lifetime of our children's generation, I personally predict you will see the urban DMV area fully surround your district, and you will regret every time you built things a little too spread out because it seemed possible to do it now, and you will be happy that you built something of very high quality that helps drive that growth of the area, as opposed to you're kind of surrounded by it and then you're landlocked and you can't go back and retrofit. Build it great from the start, and building it great from the start means not just great office and lab space, but all this other stuff I've been talking about.
So I have to say, heck yeah.
It's quite in the news. Sorry, Shakur Abdullah, Biotech Biopharma Consulting.
Right.
But I had a question about AI and HEI in terms of how that's going to play into driving the workforce and the workers. Have you done any research looking at is it going to drive more hiring, less? Where if you have one worker who can work with AI to kind of do multiple tasks, or you have an AGI where the CEO can just come and tell it, here's all the things I want you to get done this month.
I think that everyone heard the question about AI. I think that anyone who stands here on this stage or anywhere and makes concrete predictions about where AI, AGI technology will take us is not very smart. I'm not making it that smart. I'm smart enough to not try to do that. So let me say something about what I teach a class on economic history most years at SMU. Let me say something about what history suggests, and then we can talk about whether maybe things might be different this next time. Always the most famous, most dangerous words in the English language, like it's different this time. Right? What history abundantly teaches is that new technological revolutions disrupt many jobs, but they don't destroy jobs in total. They create as many as they destroy. Simple story: if you went in a time machine to 1870 and you talked to Americans and said, "Let's see, it looks like well over 50% of all of you all who work are working in agriculture, and I'm from the future, and I can tell you that in the year 2025 it will be less than 2% working in agriculture," they would have predicted an apocalypse. Mass unemployment and starvation. And neither of those things clearly occur. Why is this so? Very simple story, and then the interesting question is whether this will play out with AI. The simple economic story is some one or two firms are the early implementers of some radical new technology, which allows them to do something cheaper, better, and so forth. And they have a shot for a little while at phenomenal profits as a result, right? But then everybody else comes in, undercuts them, implements similar technologies, the price goes way down, and all of us spend a smaller share of the dollars in our pocket on that good or that service, and we have dollars that are freed up for other things, and the people that used to work in that old sector are freed up to do new things, and we've invented new things, new products and services, and now you have new ideas, a workforce that's ready to work in those things, and a demand for it. So the creation of the new things creates new jobs. That's the simple story. Where could this go wrong? One way it could go wrong is if we totally flub antitrust and competition in America. If we allowed a really small number of firms to completely dominate AI services to a degree that they still have enormous profit margins 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and we're paying as much as ever for the goods and services that we buy. That would be an epic failure. That would be what I would call the decline of capitalism in America. And then we would see a lot of net job destruction. Hasn't happened before because we have had a competitive economy that generally, on the whole, not perfectly, prevented permanent, long-term, very high-margin monopolies. Okay. So where do I think it goes as regards innovation districts? I think probably what happens is we will figure out how to automate all kinds of rote functions, and for most people who know how to do research or research-related jobs in an innovation district type setting, work will not go away. People who figure out how to use the tools, same as they had to already use the other tools that were invented over the last several decades, they got to figure out how to use the tools that are invented going forward. And people who figure out how to do that reasonably well will have jobs that are more engaging, more interesting, less of the drudgery. I mean, whose job includes, who out there you all are all professionals and all successful. Is there some drudgery in your job? Yes? Okay. Probably that goes down. I mean, I'm finally bullish. But we could mess it up. Part of the challenge of the future is that one thing we've generally not done a great job in America is when people's jobs get disrupted and they are in a position where they are hurt by technological change, and it would be helpful for them to, if you will, retool and learn to do new things. We're not very good at that, helping to do the new thing in America. We've had pockets of efforts here and there, and not all of them are terrible, but I don't think anybody would look at that whole collective effort in our country and say, we nailed that. And we've got to get better at it as we roll into this new era. And I hope that I'm alone, not just waiting for the federal government to provide salvation, but I hope that right here in Prince William County, as you build out this innovation district, you'd be thinking from the get-go about how to actually create those retooling, reskilling, upskilling opportunities for people who live here.
Time for one last question.
You did a great job. Thank you so much. We're so glad that you're here.
Thank you.
It's the absolute best place in America, so we're glad that you're here.
I gotta stay here now.
Absolutely. Having said that, I do have two quick questions. One is, and I really appreciate what you shared before about the importance of density, and that's something that I think we definitely need to work on. And I know all of our local elected officials heard that message really clearly, and density is huge. But I wanted to ask you, so with RTP, they seem to hit all the markers. How important is branding in terms of kind of like, so this area has so many things that are happening. And for us to be able to attract top talent, obviously we need all the substantive inputs. But in terms of distinguishing ourselves in this area, how important is branding? Because I've noticed that no one really seems to have a name that just kind of pops.
Yeah.
So how important is branding? And also, in the charts that you showed, it was clear that Singapore and Germany are putting significant amounts of money into research and development and are outpacing us. What are your thoughts on how we can turn some of that around? If you're not looking to the federal government for solutions, but we need to increase research dollars to match what's happening, because Singapore is really a reflection of China and Germany a reflection of the EU. How could we change the trajectory with those things? So branding and greater investment in research.
You asked two, but you started with a statement. Could I make it three and talk about density real quick?
Please. Please talk about more density.
So I'm on kind of a national task force that I was asked to be on that includes some people in this area on housing and how we solve our housing crisis in America. And one person came who was an expert on communications and branding, but in this case around how those of us who would like to see more housing get built in our country might communicate better. And so this guy presented to us and gave us advice on say more of this, say less of that, because our research says saying this is bad. So density is a dirty word. I'm not afraid to say it in front of you all because, hey, I'm not running for anything, and I'm kind of an academic and so forth. But if you say, let's create more density in our community, apparently, my understanding is people who have run for office and people who have studied the public opinion will say, huge turnoff. It produces a lot of images in their mind that they don't like. So don't talk density, please. Talk about creating a variety of good opportunities to own and live in a home of whatever suits the needs of a family, including starter homes for young people. Forget about the density thing. Just let's allow homes to be built so that our children, as they grow up, can live here, where they grew up. Okay? So that's my advice from someone who is a branding expert. Second, on the branding thing, I don't feel like I know a lot about how to be good at branding. I think that you certainly wouldn't want to leave it aside and not do it at all. I do think it is the case that quite a few innovation districts are almost totally unheard of in their own community. That can't be good. All the time I run into people in the Dallas area who've never heard of any of the Pegasus Park is the most prominent one of any of the ones that I am involved in advising and spending time with at all. So I guess there is a lot of work to be done. Research Triangle Park built a phenomenal brand. Would you agree with that? A huge brand reflecting that it was originally the initiative of the governor, and apparently just about, I don't know, there could be exceptions. I think just about every governor of North Carolina since then has been into the story, Research Triangle Park, and now other other parks and districts in Charlotte and elsewhere in North Carolina. So for whatever reason, they figured out in that state, we're no longer going to tell a story about tobacco and old-timey industries. We're going to tell a story about innovation and research. So that's a pretty excellent branding exercise. I don't think either Texas or Virginia or a lot of other states quite have the same degree of like state level, gubernatorial, kind of powerful messaging year in and year out, governor after governor. So I recommend that you have it. And it'd be great if your governors, you all seem to have a new one every 4 years. I don't know about that, but maybe it's good. Maybe it's great. I don't know. But as for your last question, I do think it would be great news if governors everywhere had their short list of the great innovation districts and great research institutions of their state, and they could roll those off the tip of their tongue, speech after speech after speech, and tell their fellow citizens how important it is. As for,
Can I just say one thing about RTP? Don't be too literal. Don't be too literal in your brand, because if you know anything about RTP, the 3 universities, none of them are actually in RTPs. Right. Actually, they're 30 miles apart from each other. So, I mean, they took some assets around them that are not literally in the innovation district or research park. So anyway, think outside the box.
I agree with my friend Brian, for sure. As for how we can build support for more research in this country, or what other sources there might be, I don't think state and local governments are going to be the source of a lot of incremental dollars. I think that's just about inconceivable. Might be a few at the margin. In my state, somehow, despite all the sometimes weirdness of my state, the state legislature has seen fit to create actually one really innovative program called CPRIT, Cancer Prevention and Research Institute of Texas. So the state government has funded an NIH-like effort just for cancer, just in Texas. $6 billion appropriated so far. I'm glad they did that. So that's kind of visionary, so maybe there are little pockets here and there. Not counting federal government, I suppose the 2 pockets that look kind of deep, one obviously would be industry. Here's what I would say about industry research. This is in our report, but universities that have a really heavy dependence on industry funding, like as a large share of their total research enterprise, actually score pretty low on measures of what we call innovation impact in the report. So I think you have to be very careful about that whole source of funding. All money is green, if you will. It's good to have it. But on the other hand, if it comes with maybe too many strings, it's potentially leading to kind of suboptimal outcomes in terms of building a great world-class research operation. So I hope that's a growing source of funds, but I also hope universities they're going to be really intelligent about working out those kind of deals as well. And then, of course, there's very deep-pocketed individuals making philanthropic gifts. We're fortunate to have probably more than our fair share in the big Texas cities of that. I'm hopeful we can keep on increasing that, but I think it's actually unlikely that that's a big enough source to fully replace if the federal government piece goes down a lot. Let's hope the federal government piece, if it's going to go down, only goes down some. But I do think finally that America is going to be well and truly in the game. At the end of the day, basic research is what we call a public good in economics. No one person or no one firm will ever benefit enough from it to justify the full investment we as a society would like to see. It must be paid from the collective resources, and the only pockets deep enough are the federal government. And so I don't know what else to tell you other than it's a bit of a difficult time, to say the least, but the pendulum keeps swinging, history rolls on, and all of us who care about this need to do what my friends here have been doing for years and get out there and keep on trying to convince our fellow citizens as well as our national leaders that American preeminence in science and technology, we decided as a country to do this basically after World War II. We were massively successful. That is, in fact, a major factor that put America in the position that it is, that made it as great as it is, if you will. We move away from that at our peril. Recommitting to basic science and technology leadership, I would argue, is just about, if it's not number one, it's certainly among the top 3 or 4 things we must do as a society if we want to be successful over the remainder of the 21st century. Keep up the great work you're doing. I am so honored to be with you. Thank you so much.